Hi, Graham from Affordable Leather Products here. Normally I'd be talking about our BDSM gear, but this time I've got a much more serious subject to discuss. On Wednesday the 9th of December, Dame Diana Johnson introduced a private member's bill called the Sexual Exploitation Bill. Ostensibly it's to protect vulnerable women and girls, but it's actually an attempt to introduce the Nordic model of sex work into the UK, which, whilst making it legal to be a sex worker, makes it illegal to pay a sex worker for their services. Despite a rebuttal from Labour MP Lyn Brown, who explained that it was counterproductive and it would put sex workers at greater risk, the bill has its second reading on the 29th of January. This talk explains some of the reasons why this is bad for all sex workers, including pro-doms and pro-subs, etc., and to persuade you to urgently contact your MP and ask that they attend or view the second reading and then vote against this misguided bill on the 29th. You can contact your MP via the website theyworkforyou.com. That's all one word, theyworkforyou.com. So what is the Nordic model? Well, you may hear it being referred to by other names such as end demand, the equality model, rescue services, sex buyers law, and so on. Another term is partial decriminalisation or decriminalisation of sex work, but with criminalisation of clients. However, these are just attempts to deceive people by stealing the word decriminalisation and misrepresenting what they are trying to do. Sex workers do want decriminalisation, but not on the terms that the Nordic model supporters offer, because whilst it may appear to be a good idea and its supporters claim that it will protect sex workers, the facts show differently, and it's just an underhand way of using the law to eliminate any and all sex work, even when done by consenting adults. By the way, to counter some of the classic responses from sex work abolitionists, I need to clarify that I'm not a John or a punter, neither am I a member of the mythical pimp lobby, which are some of the accusations they level against men who dare to stand up for sex workers' rights, either because I'm a client, or I'm a controller and exploiter of women, or in some cases, both at the same time. Also, despite the fact that I sell BDSM gear, including to sex workers, the majority of my customers are Mr. and Mrs. or Mr. and Mr. or Mrs. and Mrs. J Public, so despite the assertions by Nordic Model supporters, I am not doing this simply for my own selfish benefit. Through my business and from the markets I sell at, I know a fair number of sex workers, and I also know that many of them and their organisations are on Twitter too. More importantly, I have listened to them and what they want, rather than the Nordic model supporters who, it seems, much prefer to talk over or about sex workers or only listen to the ones who support their desire to eliminate all sex work. This is clearly shown as the campaigning group Nordic Model Now says at the top of their website they are the, quote, movement for the abolition of prostitution, unquote. Also, they state that the aim of the Nordic model is to, I quote again, make it clear what we as a society consider unacceptable and discouraging people from doing those things, unquote. So they want to tell consenting adults, and especially women, what they can or cannot do of their own free will. Remember also that the Nordic model says it's legal to be a sex worker, but illegal for anyone to pay them. This makes about as much sense as saying it's legal to open and run a restaurant, but illegal for anyone to buy a meal from you. Clearly you're going to go out of business fairly quickly if that happens, which of course is exactly their aim. So here are some of the effects of the Nordic model and the ways in which it's been enforced. For instance, in France, after the Nordic model was introduced in 2016, a year-long study by the NGO Médecins du Monde determined that 63% of sex workers said they experienced deterioration in the working conditions, 42% had experienced an increase in violence, and 38% said it was harder to negotiate the use of condoms. None of these, of course, are advantageous to sex workers. More disturbingly, in 2019, 10 French sex workers were murdered within 6 months, yet in June 2020, the French government published the evaluation of the law, except not a single page addressed the violence that sex workers have experienced since the law came into force, and they completely ignored the reports from Médecins du Monde. Meanwhile, In Ireland, there has been a 92% increase in violence against sex workers reported to Ugly Mugs, which is a sex worker support organisation, in the years following the introduction of the Nordic model there. In Norway, the police ran a campaign they called Operation Homeless, where, when they found a sex worker, they would contact their landlord and tell them that unless they evicted the sex worker, they would be charged with pimping. In Sweden, because she was a sex worker, a woman called Petite Jasmine lost custody of her children to their father, who was known by the police to be violent and who had threatened and stalked her previously. In 2013, on a visit to her children, he murdered her. There are many more stories like these of the detrimental effects that the Nordic model has had on sex workers, yet these are ignored by its supporters or sometimes even justified as part of the cost of eliminating sex work. So has the Nordic model actually worked? Well, a report by the Norwegian Ministry of Justice and Public Security for the Norwegian government in 2014 found the Swedish law, as they refer to it as, had created a buyer's market and violence against sex workers had increased. There has been no evidence of a decrease in the purchase of sex work in Sweden, or that the people who sell sex are better off. But in 2010, the Swedish government declared the Swedish model a success, and that any negative consequences, including increased stigma against sex worker, quote, must be viewed as positive from the perspective that the purpose of the law is indeed to combat prostitution, unquote. In other words, if the state wants to eradicate sex work, it may do so by eradicating sex workers. The fundamental danger of the Nordic model is that it gives clients more power over sex workers because they have less chance to screen out the bad ones due to them being less willing to give details, and they will withhold phone numbers, etc., preventing the sex workers' use of Client Eye app and similar resources which allow them to warn others of time wasters or aggressive and dangerous customers. What about exit programs? The Nordic model supporters might claim that there are exit programs, but sex workers' own experiences show that these pay the barest lip service to the idea of actually helping them once they've quit. I will point out here that sex workers themselves also support the idea of exit programs for people who want to leave the job. However, exiting sex work is not something that can be enforced by law. It has to be done by providing adequate support mechanisms, especially financial, to replace sex work income. So what about sex trafficking? Well, one of the classic claims of the Nordic model supporters is that they are doing it to, quote, stop sex trafficking, unquote. However, this ignores the fact that illegal trafficking and consensual sex works are entirely not the same thing. For a start, more people are actually trafficked for labour than sex work in the UK, according to research by the Howell Foundation, yet the Nordic model supporters don't seem to want to close down nail bars and stop domestic works or fruit picking, etc., because some people are trafficked into those jobs. Nor do they want to arrest the people who go to nail bars or buy fruit in order to end demand in those industries. If trafficking happens in manual labour, we address it by improving labour rights. The sex industry, however, is made illegal and driven underground, making it less safe. Additionally, we don't make labour rights contingent on which part of your body are involved in the labour. Sex workers want to stop exploitation and coercion as much as anyone, and of course they are the ones best placed to spot and identify it and report it, but they can't if they risk arrest or harassment by the police if they do so. Here are some of the perennial myths about sex work that the abolitionists like to include in their campaigning material. A classic claim is that clients buy consent and that once they have paid their money, they can do anything they want to a sex worker. This is nonsense, of course. A client no more buys the consent of a sex worker than you buy the consent of a plumber, dentist or therapist. I should point out here that the New Zealand decriminalisation law specifically states that sex workers can withdraw consent at any time. The abolitionists also like to repeat the results of a questionnaire which said that 89% of sex workers want to leave the job. What they don't say is the question was actually, would you leave the job if you had an alternative that paid better? I think you'll find if you ask most people, they would say that they would leave their jobs if they had an alternative that paid better. Abolitionists like to use expressions like prostituted women to refer to sex workers, which implies that they're all forced into it and it is something that is done to them, so they're all victim. This completely denies sex workers agency and choice. Also, please note that they never seem to refer to men or trans people. Clearly they don't care about them or think that they need rescuing. They also like to use the word pimp, which is used to imply abuse and coercion and exploitation of sex workers. But if you want to hire an actor or a musician, you don't necessarily approach them directly. You contact their representative, who will sort out the booking, arrange the terms, and then take a percentage of the fee for their work. These people are called agents or managers, which are much less pejorative terms. Sex workers, quote, sell their bodies, unquote, is another abolitionist cry, but offering someone a service for money is no more selling their body than any other worker sells their body to their employer. I'd mention here that there are plenty of other jobs which have a much higher risk of injury or causing long-term debilitating conditions, etc., yet there are no campaigns to make it illegal to employ people in these professions. So, what do sex workers want? Sex workers want full decriminalisation, as has been introduced in New Zealand and New South Wales and most lately in the Northern Territories in Australia. Decriminalisation removes laws that put unnecessary barriers in the way of sex workers, such as requiring licences, registration on government databases, compulsory medical tests, and which treats sex work just like any other form of employment with the same rights and protections for workers. It also removes the police as regulators of the sex industry and repeals laws that are specific to sex work. Decriminalisation also gives much better relationships between sex workers and police, because the workers know that they're not going to be ignored or told it's just part of the job, or they shouldn't have started in the first place. 5 years after introducing decriminalisation, the New Zealand Prostitution Law Review Committee carried out research and found that there was no evidence of an increase in the number of sex workers nor a rise in trafficking in the country. Among the organisations whose members have issued statements that have supported decriminalisation are Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the World Health Organization, the Lancet Journal, the British Medical Journal, Doctors Without Borders, the Global Alliance Against Trafficking of Women, Freedom Network USA, the National Union of Students, and, most importantly, the House of Commons' own Home Affairs Select Committee on Prostitution, who produced a report in 2016 recommending decriminalisation. So what can you do about this bill? Well, please write or email to your MP. As mentioned previously, you can find their details at the website theyworkforyou.com. That's all one word, theyworkforyou.com. Please keep your letter polite and reasonably short, no more than a side or two A4, and don't forget to include your name and postal address, otherwise MPs may well reject the letter or email. Please do this urgently, because the second reading of the bill is on the 29th of January, so the sooner they hear about it, the more chance we have of getting them to oppose it. Also, of course, the Nordic Model supporters will be doing their own campaigning, so the more of us write to counter their lies and distortions, the better. I will put a transcript of this talk on my website at affordableleather.co.uk/Nordic Model if you want to use it as a base for your own letter. Thank you for listening.